So thank you again for your time today. Up here on the slide, I have a loose agenda that I would like to follow during this session, but please do stop me at any time for questions or dialogue. So in terms of introductions, I think there are a couple of new folks here, so let's just go around the table, blah, blah, blah. So what I would like to do this afternoon is present my most recent research to you that culminated in a successful dissertation defense about 3 weeks ago. I'd also like to draw some connections from my study to NLU and then talk about our shared vision for this position. Lastly, I'd like to open it up for dialogue towards the end as well. So let me set the stage here. My research topic was factors affecting the employment outcomes of for-profit college graduates. I defined for-profit colleges as the sector of higher ed that can privately gain from financial aid dollars received on behalf of their students. Examples of which could be the University of Phoenix, ITT Technical Institute, and DeVry University, just to name a few. I studied this topic not only because I had worked in the for-profit education sector for many years, but also because I saw an interesting intersection in literature about for-profits between the high cost of tuition, as well as good performance in the retention and graduation areas at the two-year level, but we're seeing that their graduates are making less than or just on par with community college peers. Most importantly, and what served as the inspiration for this study, is I found a newer body of research that demonstrated that employers seem to have a preference towards nonprofit institutions. So I set out to add to this dialogue and see if the perceptions of HR professionals are contributing to these troubling outcomes. I chose implicit social cognition as the lens for this study, as it helped to explain why an HR professional might say that education type, and by that I mean for-profit versus nonprofit, does not matter to them, yet make decisions that might say otherwise. Specifically, I used two theories of implicit social cognition, mere exposure and implicit bias, as the lenses in reviewing the literature and in analyzing my findings. By way of definition, mere exposure demonstrates that people will assign favorability to things that they have more experience with, and implicit bias demonstrates people can develop unconscious attitudes and beliefs about things without their conscious awareness. So with all of that background in mind, the guiding question for this phenomenological study was, how do HR professionals make sense of how they place value on the type of institution a prospective employee graduated from in the screening and hiring process? Embedded there were two sub-questions that asked, what value is placed on education type, and what experiences and information do HR professionals use in making decisions regarding education type? HR professionals in this study were recruiters working in healthcare and technology-related companies, consistent with common program offerings at for-profit colleges. As a high-level view of my methodology, since it was a phenomenological study that required purposeful sampling, I designed a sample selection exercise given to 18 participants who were evenly split into two groups. Both received the same customer service representative job description and two similar resumes. One where the candidate graduated from a for-profit institution, and in this case Kaplan College, and the other from a nonprofit institution, and I chose Southern New Hampshire University. I then asked them to choose their preferred candidate. The only difference between the groups was that the resumes had the types of institutions reversed between them. So in addition to ensuring the participants had a recent experience to comment on during their interviews, I was curious to see if the nonprofit candidates were more often selected, perhaps under the influence of implicit social cognition. Originally, I was only going to interview just those that had selected the nonprofit candidate, but after a participant changed her mind during her interview, I decided to invite all 18 to interview. 16 participants agreed to proceed into the in-depth interview stage that I conducted virtually so as not to limit my participant pool by geography. And in being mindful of how implicit social cognition works, I embedded the questions around education type rather casually within the context of them just walking me through their entire screening process. Once all the interviews were completed and transcribed, I followed Clark Moustakis' method of data analysis, starting with micro-meaning to macro-meaning generation, where I organized participant statements into clusters of meaning called meaning units, I then developed a textural and structural definition of what, when, and how these participants experienced resume selection, with particular attention paid to education type. So on this slide, the table shows you each of the meaning units that I came up with and the count of participants that made statements consistent with those units. And just a quick note here that many participants made comments that were consistent with several categories, so the table is not summative. You'll see here that there are 4 main meaning units. The first one, where participants indicated that education type, again, for-profit versus nonprofit, didn't matter to them, but they are clearly in the minority, where the majority made statements that indicated education type may matter, but their reasons varied between the remaining meaning units. As noted here, only 3 participants indicated education type did not matter to them. The remainder of participants would say something to the effect of, "It didn't matter to me, but," and then they would temper their response into one or more of the meaning units, suggesting education type does indeed matter. Of those, 4 participants made explicit statements that the college listed being a for-profit mattered to them. One of them seemed to be behaving under the influence of mere exposure and expressed affinity for for-profits, attributed to her recent working experience. The other 3 seemed to have developed a bias either based on their personal experience or news stories when they said things such as, "There's no reason to attend a for-profit institution," and furthermore, that the quality was poor. 3 participants indicated that education type did not matter for a customer service representative position, but it might matter for higher levels in their organization. They made statements such as, "Well, for a customer service representative position, where they went to school doesn't really matter." These statements seem to suggest possible bias against for-profit institutions, but only if the position has more authority in the organization. 6 participants made statements to the effect that it being a for-profit didn't matter to them, but they know it matters to others, such as hiring managers, and to those outside of their organization as well. Statements in this meaning unit went on to describe known discriminatory practices amongst hiring managers at their companies, where they might only recruit from Ivy League institutions, or perhaps even refuse candidates from for-profit institutions. They also knew of companies who had made decisions not to hire from well-known for-profits, such as the University of Phoenix. So they attested that they do not possess this bias, but they know others that make decisions on hiring due to type of institution. Lastly, 8 participants made statements that indicated that education type, as it pertains to for-profit versus nonprofit, mattered less to them than if the college or university was one they had an existing relationship or preference for. Statements in this category referenced high-profile, well-branded institutions such as Harvard or Purdue, and/or they would indicate that if they had an unspoken relationship with an institution, they would likely show preference for their graduates. Though it is worth mentioning, they would often say they would prefer Ivy League graduates even if they had no experience with the institution. This meaning unit seemed to demonstrate that mere exposure to nonprofits by way of their longevity and brand name appeal could be influencing decisions away from for-profit candidates. After completing the textual and structural descriptions, and if one expands the definition of education type to include preferred institutions, I summarized from all of these meaning units that education type on a resume does indeed matter in the selection process, though the reasons for that might vary. I also came to the conclusion from this study that candidates with well-known nonprofit colleges listed on their resume may fare better than lesser-known for-profit peer institutions being listed. This study seems to confirm and provides texture to the body of literature that I outlined in my thesis, suggesting that employers have a preference for nonprofit institutions. In addition to providing another data point demonstrating that employers do seem to prefer nonprofits, it provides more context into the phenomenon and suggests some possible reasons for this preference as well in terms of the theories of implicit social cognition. Moreover, the study calls into question whether the positive outcomes in retention and graduation of for-profit students outweighs the challenges these students will face when they enter the job market. It also further exacerbates the high cost of tuition charged by for-profits and provides legitimacy to legislation such as gainful employment, where the federal government would like for-profits to demonstrate adequate return on investment to students. And lastly, this study could add to the broader understanding of the literature I found on for-profit disgraces and demonstrate what might be considered the long-term impact of HR professionals and society in general being exposed to these negative news stories regarding for-profits. In my final chapter, I discuss ways in which many stakeholders in my study could reflect on this data and make changes. Chief among them were for-profits to reflect upon this data and to work more closely with employer partners and perhaps to also lower tuition. Most importantly, a key stakeholder of my study were current and prospective students that I implored to reflect on data about their future wage earnings and employer preferences for nonprofits and really consider the possible pitfalls they may experience having a for-profit college listed on their resume. And for me, that's the ultimate significance of this study, is the implications of these findings on the future of the for-profit student. The persistent stigma associated with for-profit colleges and universities seemed to influence the decisions of this research study pool and could end up negatively impacting for-profit students from obtaining quality and sustaining employment upon graduation. And for-profit students, just like any, are earnestly seeking ways to improve their quality of life, but they seem to be finding lower paying jobs with twice the cost. So my study not only highlighted this social inequity, but added to the body of literature of implicit social cognition applied to the area of human resource professionals, and also added rich texture to the evolving literature on for-profits. To me, National Louis University serves a similar urban student body, but without the exorbitant tuition and that for-profit brand stigma that I referred to. And that's really one of the chief reasons that I am here today. Stop saying chief. In light of that, I wanted to highlight some of the things I mentioned in my interview earlier in terms of our shared vision for this role, really centered around quality education at an affordable price, which is nearly some of the words that I used in my recommendations for my study. I see this taking shape from this role through four main objectives that I know you already excel at. I just kind of view my role as picking up the baton and running with it. I'd love your thoughts on these as well. So I see them as a continued focus on student outcomes, focus on thoughtful and skilled instruction, certainly administrative excellence, a focus on strategic partnerships, and lastly, a focus on innovation. So let me just run through these and I'll give you some ideas of what I think these areas of focus could look like. In terms of student outcomes and in service to the student, I'd like to see more proactive and some tighter partnerships with advising to identify at-risk student behaviors earlier on, and also a continued emphasis and collaboration with initiatives on identifying pre-enrollment gaps and remedial strategies associated with them. In terms of thoughtful and skilled instruction, what I mean by that is I know we have a dedicated and skilled faculty body already. I really see my role continuing this tradition and perhaps having more time to focus on faculty recruitment, individualized professional development of the faculty, both from a pedagogy and a subject matter perspective, and also, perhaps more data that we can be looking at to assess student learning. And lastly, consistent and strategic course development plans that will really aid in that instruction. And on a related item, I look at administrative excellence. For me, this is a place of comfort with my extensive background in operations. And I really kind of see us rallying around our shared commitment to deadlines around course setup and grade posting, as well as really thorough course prep and timely grading and instruction. And when I think about strategic partnerships, I think the most important one that I think about is our partnership with the National College of Education, so that we can really be leveraging and sharing best practices between both of those departments and really utilizing all of the great work on pedagogy that they've done at NCE. But then also looking at the business community at large, where we could work on a few things. And in this category, I think about brand awareness in the communities that we serve, that could be related to increased enrollment opportunities, and maybe most importantly, opportunities for experiential learning for our students that could lead to long-term employment in their fields. And then certainly utilizing them to ensure that our programs are timely and relevant and that we're really keeping up with critical trends in the industry. And lastly, I see a focus on innovation. I continue to embrace new methodologies for student engagement, but also I think this focus on innovation needs to be around continuing to develop new programs, looking at new modalities for teaching and new pathways from undergraduate to graduate levels so that we can retain students longer and lead them to even higher levels in a company upon graduation. So again, this is kind of my view of this role, and I really look to your expert opinions as to other things I may not have thought about yet, or some of your additional thoughts in each of those categories as well. And maybe that's a nice segue into sort of the question and answer dialogue portion of this presentation as well, if that works for all of you.